Hei kaikille! Olen Josefina Tuomala, lavajointajanne tänään. Tervetuloa! Meillä on ollut täällä kaupunginteatterilla 3 päivää täynnä toinen toista mielenkiintoisempia keskusteluja ja reilusti yli 100 asiantuntijaa puhumassa. Seuraavaksi pienellä näyttämällä alkaa Eurooppa-foorumin viimeisen päivän viimeisin ohjelmanumero. Ohjelman kieli on englanti, joten jatkan juonon loppuun myös englannin kielellä. Hello everyone, I am Josefina Tuomala, your stage host today. Welcome to the small stage. At the Turku City Theatre, we have had 3 days full of interesting discussions and well over 100 experts speaking. Now, one of the Europe's Forum's finest programs is starting. If you want to participate in the chat discussion, you may read the QR code on the screen, which takes you straight to the chat. Now, let's welcome onto the stage the Foreign and Security Policy Seminar entitled European Parliament Elections and the Future of European Security. The seminar is brought to you by the University of Turku and Åbo Academy University. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Welcome to this event called European Parliamentary Elections and the Future of European Security. My name is Inga Saikkonen. I'm a senior lecturer at Åbo Academy, and I'll be moderating this event together with Kimmo Elo, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Eastern Finland and still has an affiliation with the University of Turku. The event has 2 parts. First, Professor Kim Strandberg from Åbo Academy University will present latest survey results on Finnish citizens' attitudes towards European parliamentary elections and the EU, based on Eurooppa research infrastructure, which is funded by the Academy of Finland and based at Åbo Academy University. We will then move on to a panel discussion, European parliamentary elections and the future of European security. But first, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Kim Strandberg is Professor of Political Science and Political Communication at Åbo Academy University. His research focuses on social media and politics, democracy, elections, public opinion, democratic innovations, and currently affective polarization. He is, however, probably best known to the general public for having served as the opponent of Dr. Jenny Hauke's dissertation. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. There. All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the introduction by Inga. So I'm going to talk a little bit about EU voting patterns and EU attitudes in Finland from 2024. So this is how I'm going to do it, 2 clear parts. But first, as Inga said, this data has been collected in a panel which we have called Kansalaismielipide, Citizens' Opinion. And this is a panel of roughly 7,000 Finnish citizens, of whom almost 4,000 responded to a survey in June 2024, immediately after the European election. And this panel is one of several panels, part of the Eurooppa infrastructure, which is short for Finnish Research Infrastructure in Public Opinion Research, which is a consortium between Åbo Academy, Turun yliopisto, and Tampere University, and also the Finnish Social Science Data Archive is part of that infrastructure. So that's the marketing part. But go and check Eurooppa.fi out if you're interested in what we are doing. But yeah, the 2 parts. The first one will be about voting patterns. How did women and men vote, for which parties? Are there differences, and what in party choice concerning the age of voters? And finally, the same. Can we see differences in voting patterns due to education level? So not going to go deeper than that. I only have 20 minutes, but yeah, so kind of looking at who voted for which party. We all know how the election went, but this is not about that. It's like digging a bit deeper than the surface. Then the second part is about the Finns' attitudes towards the EU. So starting off with some general support for EU, a couple of survey questions about that, and breaking that up according to gender, age, and education level again. And then finally, some Finnish citizens' views on European security and security policies, which I think ties nicely into the discussion later on. But let's get into it. So, voting patterns. We start according to gender and party. I'm not going to talk through every single number here, so I'm just going to give the main things. What you can see, we have two parties that are clearly women's parties, the Left Alliance and the Green League, as you can see. And two parties who are very much dominated by male voters, the National Coalition and the True Finns, or the Finns as they are now called. So that's kind of the main takeaway. We have a quite big difference in who votes for this party. I think those of us who are from Finland are not surprised. This is kind of the hunch we have, and we've seen a lot of media attention saying the same thing about this, that we have this a big gender difference in Finland at the moment. But that's kind of the main takeaway according to gender. Other interesting things here are perhaps that the Swedish People's Party also has become quite a women's party, perhaps more than before, I would say. But other than that, I think those are the main things. Of course, if you would add to this gender aspect also age, you would see, like in the youngest age group, the difference between men and women is even more drastic. So that's where the big cleavage gender differences are at the moment in Finland. But let's go on to, no, we didn't, age groups. Again, not going to go through everything, just tell you the main things. And we kind of have the same two groups of parties. We have the National Coalition Party and the True Finns, but also a little bit the Social Democratic Party actually here and the Centre Party that are more supported by older people belonging to middle age or even like the retired people vote for these parties. And then the opposite, probably not a surprise to most, the Left Alliance and the Green League are supported by the youngest voter group. So those are the main things we see in the voting patterns according to age. A bit interesting perhaps that the support for the Finns is strongest among middle-aged, the middle age group, and quite low in both the polls, so to speak. Kind of surprising to me at least. But still, yeah, again, quite stark differences. We have like, again, the kind of the theme of my presentation, we have two groups of parties and they are very different according to who vote for them. I don't think there's much more with that, and going then to education level. So a little bit before I talk about the findings, what does education level mean? This is basic education, means like the compulsory education you have in Finland, like up until high school, and then secondary is everything else except university or University of Applied Sciences level degrees, so you know what it means. There are different ways to be more granular in education level, but this is the typical one we use. Again, sorry to say the same thing, we have different patterns again. We have National Coalition Party. Well, here it kind of breaks actually, because we have the National Coalition Party and the Green League, who are supported very strongly by highly educated people. So, although those parties were quite opposite regarding gender or age, here they have the same kind of pattern. Also, the Swedish People's Party is supported the most by people with the highest education level. The parties who are supported mostly by people with basic education level are the Left Alliance, which perhaps is a bit surprising given their public image of being more like an intellectual urban party, but still they receive the most votes from people with low education. Might have to do with young people who not yet have a degree voting for them to a high extent. Other than that, Centre Party voters mainly come from people with lower education, and the same for voters of the Finns. But I think that's the main things there. Quite interesting, but also perhaps not super surprising everything. Perhaps the Left Alliance surprised me a little bit, I would have thought. But other than that, no big surprises. So Final slide about voting patterns. We know that turnout in the EU elections is not that great in Finland. And we asked people who didn't vote, what were your reasons to not vote in these elections? So you can see the first reason people said that they were unable to find a suitable candidate is quite common. If you had together the lila and the turquoise colors, you get like 60% agreeing that it was hard for them to find a candidate, so they didn't vote for that reason. Not having any interest in politics was not that common a reason for not voting. So that's not the main reason why people don't vote in European elections. People did, however, feel that they don't really trust politicians and thus don't vote in at least the European elections, and that was the biggest reason actually of those that we asked about. Of course, there can be other reasons that we didn't have in a survey. That's always the thing with surveys, you get answers to what you ask, but these were the things we asked about. Not having enough information about the election or about candidates was also quite common. Not having an interest in the EU was somewhat influential, but not among the biggest reasons. And vote impact means that people felt that their vote doesn't matter. It doesn't have an impact on the result. So about 55% said that kind of was one reason for them. But yeah, you can see quite a mix of reasons why people feel that they, or stated that they didn't vote in the election. So those were the voting patterns. Let's move on to the attitudes towards the EU. So the first thing we asked, if we were to have a referendum at this moment in Finland about whether we should stay or leave the EU, as you can see, massive support for staying. Blue means stay and red means leave. The right-hand one just excludes unsure or wouldn't vote answers. So it's just people who stated an opinion. Almost 87% say that they would vote to remain in the EU. So this is, of course, a very high level of support, in my opinion, for staying in the European Union. So this is perhaps not what some parties want to see at the moment, but goes to show that not everything is as it seems in the media all the time. Finns still support the EU or remaining in the EU very, very much. This is a common question which is asked European-wide. I think these are quite high numbers in comparison to other countries, but I don't have that here. Okay, next one. Broken up according to gender, age, and education level, the same thing. Not that big differences between men and women. Both support remaining in the EU very much. A little bit more differences according to age groups, where we have middle-aged people having a bit more skeptical stance, but of course still almost 80% say they would vote to remain. This ties a little bit in, if you remember, the support for the Finns party, which was the highest in the middle-aged groups, and might be a bit correlated to that among the middle-aged people is the highest support for the most EU-critical party in Finland. And according to education level, we see quite unexpected, or unsurprisingly, that people with the lowest education level are not critical neither, but they have the highest degree of people who say they would vote to leave, 22-23%, but then it gradually diminishes from there. So among people with high university or university applied level of education, we have almost 94% support for staying in the EU. But these are not huge differences. Important to keep in mind, but some slight differences. Then we have general views on EU membership. The question was asked, would you say generally that the EU has been a good thing, the EU membership has been a good thing for Finland? So that's the left-hand one. The right-hand one is, as it says, do you feel that Finland has benefited from being part of the EU? Very similar findings, quite strong support. The general views are like, yeah, almost 90% kind of strongly or quite strongly agree that they think it's generally been a positive thing for Finland to be part of the EU. And the same amount say that, yeah, they think that Finland has benefited from being part or a member of the European Union. But yeah, probably no surprises here as well. I'm going to again break it up. That's a terrible slide, but I'm going to tell you the main takeaways. They are very similar to those we have seen. So I guess some of you could guess there are no gender differences to speak about in the general views on Finland's EU membership. Men and women equally to an equal degree feel it's been a good thing. Again, middle-aged people are slightly more of the opinion that it hasn't been a good thing, but still there's a huge support among them as well. Almost 60% feel it's been generally a good thing. And the education level goes as expected, like that. It's still a strong support among people with basic level education, but then it goes stronger and stronger when we move to secondary and tertiary level of education. And the bottom half has Finland benefited, again, precisely the same patterns. No gender differences, middle-aged people slightly more disagreeing, but still, bear in mind, still a strong support even among that group. And education, again, basic level, slightly more skeptical or critical, and then it gradually grows support or the feeling that we have benefited from being part of the EU. So those were the general attitudes. Then, let's see if it moves. Yeah, so we asked a bit about the current issues, which are very topical at the moment, security and the Ukraine. And we asked about people's opinion on should the EU form a joint army, European army. We asked whether people felt that the EU should send more armed support to the Ukraine. And we also asked whether people felt that the EU should grant a EU membership to the Ukraine. So here we see some differences in support. So basically, opinions were quite split on whether the EU should form a joint army or not. So, yeah, kind of 50-50 almost. So that's a bit different than to whether people felt we should send more armed support to the Ukraine, where you see, like, if you add the lila and the blue together, we have 80% support, very strong or somewhat strong support for sending more armed support to the Ukraine. So it's quite interesting because you would think that the joint army is also one way of supporting, but of course that's something that's perhaps more down the line, while the situation in the Ukraine is much more urgent at the moment. And finally, whether people felt that we should grant the Ukraine an EU membership. Yeah, quite strong support. Not as strong for sending more troops or arms to the Ukraine, but almost 60%, I think. Yeah, 60% support it. Only 20%, however, fully support that idea. But so interesting. So those were the views on security, and I think I'm doing too good on time, but we can have some questions from the audience or from the panel. So thank you for your attention, and please.
Should we allow some time for audience questions? Do you want?
Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. If there are direct questions,
here.
Professor Strandberg, he must leave directly after the presentation. So now is the possibility to ask a question. If not, I would like
I think
to ask.
we have some.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes. How do you think about the number supporting the joint EU army? Because I found it surprisingly high, taking into account that it just became a member in North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was how much? 30% or?
Yeah, it was kind of split in the middle. Yeah, from that perspective, it's quite surprising, yeah. But perhaps it also is due to us having joined a military alliance. Maybe we are more open to the idea of being part of something bigger, a bigger military alliance. So perhaps the NATO membership has been inducive to more positive general attitudes. That could be one way of looking at it as well.
Here is one question from the Slido possibility. So EU politics can be an excellent mode for the countries in search of third or fourth political parties. How do you, this is related to this second stage elections. How would you judge this kind of evaluation based on your data?
So if I understood the question, like people
are looking for not the first or second.
Yeah, they're kind of voting for different parties in, yeah.
Or how the political scientists say that they are not thinking so much about the coalition possibilities, but voting for the party they liked much.
Yeah, I think, of course, this election was quite exceptional due to the Lee Anderson effect, which was very obvious. That's just due to one very charismatic and competent politician. But otherwise, I haven't delved that much into reasons of why people vote, how they vote in the EU elections. But I think it's because, as you said, it's considered to be a second-order election that people don't care as much about. I think they also are more flexible in how they vote in the EU elections just due to that reason. Because, perhaps people feel it's far away, they don't understand, like in Finland, a lot of the parliament election about who will form coalition with whom, but we don't really hear much about how the coalitions are in the European Parliament. Now in June there was some information about how does the European Parliament work, but it's rare to get that info, so most people don't know. So I think, it's something people know less about, so they are perhaps not, they don't mind if their vote is a bit different than what they usually vote for. But
actually, related to their chart with those reasons for not to vote, there was the three: cannot find a suitable candidate, do not have enough information, and do not trust politicians. Do you think these are a bit interlinked, so that if the people don't trust the politicians, they are not looking for information, and when they are lacking information, they don't know enough about the candidates? So kind of a vicious circle.
Yeah.
So my question related to this, that what could we do in order to change this? That do we need to increase the information, for example, kind of information centers again, like there was in the late 1990s? Or what do you think as a researcher, what could be a very effective way to increase the interest of people also for the EP elections? Because the turnout was very low, lower than 5 years ago. Yeah. So there has not been very much improvement in this question, although there was quite much media presence before the elections.
Yeah, I agree with your first point that these are interlinked, and these are a lot of the same people stating all the reasons. This is not that people had to choose one or the other. They could agree with everything. So it's a lot of, as we say, correlation, like the same person agreeing with all the reasons. And I think probably, as you mentioned, information is probably the key, because we know, like living in Finland, we know quite little about what the EU does, what the parliament decides on, and how it affects Finland or Finnish policy. So it's, I think information has to be the key to get people to understand. But then I also think we need to accept that this is always going to be an election with lower turnout. I don't think we're going to see anything else than that in a quite a long time. But of course, the good thing with this being interlinked is that there's a key to unlock all of the reasons. Probably would be somewhat help with more information, getting to understand more, then you start to maybe trust politicians more and perhaps understanding a bit more about how the EU works, etc.
And the interesting point was that it was not the lack of interest that was the key, which was actually could be expected by other studies. Okay, now we have 1 minute if somebody wants to ask some question.
Quick reminder to me, what was the difference in voting activity in the youngest generation I didn't show it. I haven't actually looked at it from this data, but I know from previous, like when we looked at it in the parliamentary election, there was huge differences. Like, kind of if you exaggerate, young men vote for the Finns and young women for the Green League or the Left Alliance, and there are big differences. So if we have a gender issue or cleavage in Finland, it's among young men and young women, which are very different in values at the moment. And I think those patterns are probably replicated in the EU election as well.
Do you have any information about this first-time voters turnout? Because it has been extremely low in European Parliament election. I think it was below 10% last time.
I haven't looked into it yet, but we do have that information. But you need to keep in mind this is from a panel, and people who sign up for panels are generally quite interested in politics. So we probably have people who are more like.
But then it's
not
very
first time
difficult to
voters.
find these exact figures from official sources like Statistical Finland. I have been looking for this youngest cohort turnout, but it is very difficult to find.
Yeah, true. All right, now time is up.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. That was fascinating. Really interesting, really fresh data, actually, from the Firpo infrastructure panels. Now we'll move on to our panel discussion on European security, and we've given all the panelists the task to prepare a 5 minutes introductory speech, and we've asked them to focus on themes of the panel that are closest to their research interests. And we'll go in the order of the program, which you'll probably have on your mobile phones. Yes, fantastic. Thanks so much. I'd like now to introduce our speakers. Dr. Lena Vastapo is an assistant professor in the area of gender, peace and security at the Swedish Defence University. Her research concentrates on gender and war, feminist theories of international relations and war preparedness across the Nordics. Welcome, Lena. Next we have Tanja Tamminen. Dr. Tanja Tamminen leads currently an EU Commission-funded project called EU4 Dialogue that builds people-to-people contacts and professional networks in South Caucasus and Moldova. Tanja Tamminen defended her doctoral thesis in Paris in 2009, and her research focuses on regional cooperation in the Southern Balkans, and she's also an adjunct professor at the University of Turku, so we have this connection again with both University of Turku and the universities arranging this seminar. And then we have Professor Andrew Cottee, who's professor and EU Jean Monnet Chair in European Political Integration from University College Cork, Ireland. And his teaching and research are in the areas of international relations and international security. He has been a NATO Research Fellow, Research Associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a visiting researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So I would now like to ask the panelists for their introductory speeches. So we'll go in the order of the program. So Lena, if you'd like to start.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for the generous introduction. In my short introductory speech, I would actually like to take a step back from everyday politics and the actual elections. Instead, I wish to draw your attention, our attention, to Europe as a so-called epistemic community, to something that we might perhaps refer to as the idea of Europe. What is Europe? And how it plays out in the external affairs of the Union today. To do so, I really feel that we need to discuss values. Because in our everyday speech, and I have done so myself, I will continue to do so probably as well, we often refer to something called European values. Depending on who is discussing, however, this set of values might point to quite opposing directions. Sometimes the far right is framing its anti-immigrant xenophobia in these terms. Other times, conservative Christians tend to refer to Christianity as the defining value base for Europe. And then some of us link European values to absolute respect for human dignity, the rule of law, liberal democracy, and so on. So we should ask, what actually are the values we hope to secure? What are these European values? Who owns them? Wim Weymans has explored the evolution of European values as they have developed in European institutions, and here important institutions, after World War II. Weymans argues that in Europe, as in elsewhere, politicians and institutions refer to values when they need to legitimize political projects. So values are basically being used as political tools. Weymans has located 3 main ruptures during the past 80 years or so in the value talk of European elites and institutions. So first, after World War II, European values were to a large extent based on conservative, anti-communist and Christian rhetoric. Europe did not break away from its colonial legacy, but rather adopted a civilizational role in its external affairs. For instance, this is did to the extent that anti-colonial thinkers such as Sartre or Fanon denounced the spirit of Europe, the spirit of European elites and institutions, which was, according to them, and this is a quote, tainted with blood. Second rupture emerged towards the end of the Cold War, so quite a long stretch. Instead of creating a difference between Christian Europe and its communist enemy, as was regularly done before, a more secular approach emerged with the goal of creating a unified European identity. And this approach, as we know, it proved very successful. So from the late 1990s, revised European value rhetoric, value set has been and had been adopted and used not only by political elites and institutions, but also by the general public. Here we refer to value sets such as liberal democracy, human rights, rule of law, gender equality, so on. This value base, this is very interesting, became a major rhetorical device for the European Union as an institution in its external affairs as well, one of its defining features, to the extent that the Union began to frame itself as a value-based institutional actor. Go to the website of the European Union and you see it. And in this way, legitimizing its internal and external policies through these newly framed European values. So, what has all this to do with foreign policy? It has a lot to do with foreign policy, everything to do with foreign policy. So what we see now, we might see a third rupture. We might witness now witnessing now an increasing clash between liberal ideas of progress on the one hand and the conservative calls for a return to Europe's Christian roots on the other hand, more conservative roots. So maybe this situation is now a third rupture. It's emerging where we witness politicians such as Orban to portray themselves as the real defenders of European values. On the other hand, we see feminist foreign policy initiative, for instance, entering and exiting the venue. And we see very many debates on a national level, which are of course reflected on the European level. So we see battles over values, we see battles as a consequence over policy priorities. In the Union's foreign affairs, these value contestations play out, for instance, in migration policies, we all know that, but also in trade negotiations. Where should we invest? Why? And very interestingly, in climate policies. Do I still have a minute?
Yeah.
Yes. So if I give you an example, recently the Green Coalition gave its support to von der Leyen's nomination, provided that the Green Deal is secured. This is the most important value for them. At the same time, von der Leyen has been increasingly criticized over her open support to Israel. Values, Christianity, and so on. As a consequence, the former foreign policy leadership of European Union, actually the current, but the outgoing foreign policy leadership of the European Union was and is divided over Palestine and Israel, with von der Leyen on the other side and Joseph Borrell and Charles Michel on the other side. How this all plays out with Kaja Kallas as probably the new High Representative, and Antonio Costa as the likely incoming president of the European Council is yet to be seen. But yes, I would like to discuss a bit values in our future talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And
Okay.
Tanja, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. I continue straight from what Lena was saying, because I'm also wondering if there really is a real rupture out there. Even though I'm based in Brussels, I am not working in the EU institutions, but I'm bringing a bit of a practitioner's point of view to the panel. As was said, I'm leading a peace project funded by the EU Commission called this EU for Dialogue, and I facilitate dialogue in South Caucasus and Moldova, including the non-recognized entities. And recently I've been, for instance, focusing a lot on climate-related dialogues across the conflict kind of divides there. And so you will understand I make a tiny detour before answering the question about European security institutions, just to remind, and I'm not the first probably to say this, but here over the days, but to mention the United Nations. And the United Nations just launched what they call UN 2.0, the plan, because they're stating that the world is not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the plan, they identify 5 core capabilities that are necessary to create positive change in the future. And foresight is mentioned as a concrete ability to actively work towards potential futures. And this is what I wanted to highlight here, because, okay, it's Turku, here's also the Future Studies Institute. I myself have my adjunct professorship in the contemporary history. I'm an IR scholar, but future studies become more and more important, and at the same time they are more and more used in the political field. We also use foresight workshops in all our peace kind of dialogues, and also EU uses foresight in the policy work. But about foresight, UN will now in September have in the General Assembly, it's under the banner Summit of the Future, and there is a plan of a pact for the future and a declaration on future generations. So UN is going towards the future-oriented thinking. There was a future-oriented panel here yesterday. EU is on the same path. But what I want to highlight is that foresight is not just a management tool and an exercise in a way, but there really are 4 types of people, but also of institutions. There are the ones who don't challenge the change, they take it as it comes. Then they are the reactive ones, and the question is how much EU is actually a reactive one, only reacting when the alarm sounds and then goes extinguish a fire if they can. And then there are the pre-active people and actors who kind of understand that preventing is cheaper than curing. But what the foresight concept kind of talks about is the proactive approach, proactively provoking the desirable future and the desirable change. And that's kind of what I'm bringing to the panel, like to discuss about the EU's foreign policy, is asking really, is the newly elected European Parliament proactive enough? Whether it has members that want to provoke a desirable future, the same for the foreign policy leaders. very often we now see this reactive EU reacting to the negative events in the world, but how can we build future if we don't have a vision of the desired future? What comes after? What is, if you only think about support to Ukraine at the moment, how much money, how much military support, but we don't have a vision, like a clear vision. We talk about enlargement, but it's very blurry, like what it really means, the timelines, the institutional structures, and so on. So is there really now among these new leaders a kind of proactive approach, like mentality, really mindset? Because right now, where I see the rupture, what you're talking about, is really in the peace-building world. We have moved to the hard security world. We have moved to where also peace negotiations, even dialogues that EU wants to support are more about trade-offs. And I see practically now a work that I am indeed encouraged to work on climate change dialogue and not with peace builders. And I'm encouraged to work with energy experts rather than civil society actors. So even the donors' approach has really clearly changed when it comes to the peace activities. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing in itself, like we cannot build peace in a bubble. We need all the sectors of the society involved. I'm not saying that we are doing a bad job, but it is a bit worrying trend, and I think it's the trend of this rupture that we are losing a little bit what EU was about, the soft power, the democratization, the human rights, the big talk we used to have. We are now kind of dropping it from the peace talks, for instance, because it's more about hard security. And the question is like, well, it's already a cliche that liberal peace is dead, that it failed, that we are not anymore. And the scary part is that EU is also changing its discourse and kind of accepting that the liberal peace is dead. My question is, has European Parliament also dropped it? Because they have still been the kind of the ones keeping the harder line when it comes to defending human rights defenders in the world, speaking more openly and more strongly than the European foreign policy leaders have. So the question is the new parliament still ready to keep this focus and keep the values alive, as we were saying? So I stop here and continue later.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And Andrew, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this panel. So I think I'll follow on from my two co-presenters. I'll just say a bit about maybe the mechanics of EU foreign policy, which I think will link in with what's just been said, and briefly a little bit about the European Parliament, which then we can get into more. I mean, the first thing I think I would say is that if we think about the European Union as a foreign policy actor, the EU in foreign policy is a halfway house. It's more than simply an international organisation. It's not just a European version of the UN, but it's not yet a fully federal state. And in that context, then, EU foreign security policy depends on consensus amongst the member states, and that's often challenging. And we've already heard about divisions amongst the leadership in terms of the High Representative and the Commission President, but equally, if we look at the member states on the Gaza war and the Israel-Palestine conflict, we see a spectrum of positions amongst the member states, and that means it's difficult for the EU to come up with a coherent EU position. A few other comments on the EU as a foreign policy actor. The EU, if you like, is one of the three big economic blocs, if we use that language, in the world, alongside the United States and China. But the reality is that the EU often struggles to translate its economic power into political influence. And again, we see that in the Israel-Palestine case. The EU is a major trading partner of Israel. It's been the largest donor of economic aid to the Palestinian Authority, but the EU hasn't been able to translate that into political influence over the conflict. Briefly, and we may return to this, on defence, of course, Europe still depends primarily on NATO. So if we think about all those things together, the EU has sometimes been described as a new type of actor in international relations, not a classical great power. So the EU is sometimes described as a civilian power or a normative power, an institution that achieves influence by other means. But unfortunately, in a world still sometimes characterized by great power politics and hard power, that means that the EU has certain limitations. So I think if we want to think about the EU and its foreign security policy role, we need to understand those broad background factors. Second thing, just to say a couple of words briefly about, is the European Parliament's role in EU foreign policy. So the first thing to note is that the formal powers of the Parliament in terms of foreign policy are relatively limited. So the Parliament approves the appointment of the Commission, it approves the EU's budget, and it consents to agreements with other states, in particular trade agreements. But a lot of the key political decisions are in the hands of the member states rather than in the hands of the Parliament. That being said, the Parliament does have a growing role, and again, this was mentioned in what some of my co-presenters said. If you look at issues like, for instance, human rights and democracy, the Parliament, through debates, through reports and so on, has had a growing agenda-setting role in terms of EU foreign policy. So some of the tone, almost, if you like, of EU foreign policy is quite often shaped in important ways by the European Parliament. And then briefly, maybe to get on to one of the concrete subjects of this panel, which is the recent Parliament elections in June. What we saw was that the populist right increased its share of votes, it increased its share of seats, but it's still less than 1/3 of the vote and about 1/3 of the seats in the European Parliament. So in a sense, the mainstream, if you take the centre-left, centre-right, Green parties and also Liberal parties are still larger than and significantly larger than the populist nationalist parties in the European Parliament. And we saw this very clearly with the vote to approve the reappointment of Ursula von der Leyen as Commission President. So maybe then just one final introductory remark. I was trying to think about how does one try to encapsulate the EU's role in foreign policy, and the phrase which came to my mind was what I'd call limping towards utopia. So, you know, the EU is far from perfect. There are lots of flaws to EU foreign policy, EU foreign policy making, but certainly in my view, we're better off with the European Union than without it. We're better off with a European foreign policy inadequate than it is without it, and hence I come up with this phrase, limping towards utopia. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I really like that phrase, limping towards utopia. I think it encapsulates the situation really well. We're gonna continue with the discussion, but I was allowed to ask one question about EU attitudes, since which is related to Kim's presentation in Ireland. And this came up when we were preparing for this panel. And I wanted to ask about whether Brexit has had any effect on EU attitudes in Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a couple of things here. One, in general, Ireland, since it joined in 1973, public opinion has been strongly supportive of European Union membership. And I think if you looked at some of the basic statistics that we saw in the presentation a little while ago, you would see similar statistics for Ireland. The way I would encapsulate Brexit is that, you know, some supporters of Brexit in the UK and elsewhere in Europe and indeed beyond Europe hoped that some countries might perhaps follow the UK out of the European Union. And that's absolutely not been the perspective within Ireland. The way I would summarise it is to say that I think most Irish people looked at Brexit and decided that essentially the British had gone mad and that they didn't want to follow the British down the route of madness. And this was particularly clear. You saw this in public opinion polls in the years after the 2016 Brexit vote. Public opinion support for membership of the European Union was 80-90% plus in Ireland. And given, for instance, the economic problems that the UK has faced since 2016 and then since formally leaving the Union, I think the general view in Ireland is that, this is not the route down which Ireland wants to go. Now, there are specific areas such as migration and defence where, Irish public opinion and Irish views might have certain problems or questions about European integration, but nonetheless, the broad impact of Brexit has really been to reinforce the case in Ireland that the EU is good for Ireland and that Ireland should definitely remain in the EU.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting. Also in light of the data that we just saw in Kim's presentation. Now, Timo will take on the next question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for these inspiring introductions. And my question is about leadership in current setting of the EU. As you well know, that EU has been muddling through this kind of multi-crisis since early 2010. So starting with this sovereign debt crisis, followed by refugee crisis, pandemics, and now the aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine. At the same time, we have struggled with the question about this European security and foreign policy, defense policy, and so on and so forth. We have had problems with this, traditional motor and tandem between France and Germany, resulting in quarrels and discussion about who is actually leading the EU in these turbulent times. So, starting with Lena, how would you judge the current leadership in European foreign and security policy?
Well, yes, the upcoming leader, yes. Who knows yet? But I see if I forecast. I think. I don't think. I know so much money will be spent on defense, on militarization, on war preparedness, on a national level, on a European Union level, and I see that the leadership, if we will have von der Leyen and Kallas there, yes, this will be a great something they both push for. I think like that. At the same time, we have. I think Kallas said at some point that there might be, or was it von der Leyen? But anyways, that there was discussion on the possible new post of a defense commissioner, which is quite interesting as well in terms of preparing for war. And here we come to the reactiveness of European Union, and here we come to the lack of vision, and here we come to the point why don't we have why nobody talks about the need for a peace commissioner and why I don't see this leadership having such discussions. So if we think of the European Union's history as a peace project, we can't see that here that much anymore. So yeah, we will see war preparation, I think.
So Tanja,
yeah, I could continue from that, because I'm looking at, for instance, the region of South Caucasus and EU's efforts now in the past dealing with the issues, and a lot of things that Kimmo said, like who is really leading the EU? Is it the French who were trying something, Macron with Armenia, Azerbaijan? Is it the High Representative? There's still been confusion, but there's also been a lot of, difficulties between the institutions. So I hope that the new leadership will find better ways of cooperation than like the president, like van der Leyen and Charles Michel had their issues in the past years. So maybe, hopefully, if this tandem works as well as the High Representative and President of the Council works, like then hopefully there is also hope for peace, because it's not one person, but this is the trio that can mediate, that could or should mediate, but then at the same time, how to handle the high expectations. Like EU is expected to be a peace actor. That's what we've been selling for years. And then suddenly, we don't have that vision. We don't really know what we are. Are we still that peace actor selling democratization and human rights within the package? Or are we another type of peace actor? And that kind of also doesn't give EU like a predictable role in, now I'm talking smaller conflicts than the big one. I'm not referring to Ukraine here, but there's been a lot of conflict areas where EU has been active, but where the expectations have failed over the past years. So to be seen how the next leadership rebuilds this image of a peace mediator. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sander. How you?
Thank you. I might just add one or two things. I mean, firstly, just I think to note the likely appointment of Kaja Kallas, former Prime Minister of Estonia, as the EU's foreign policy representative. I mean, this will be the first time that a representative from one of the Central and East European member states has taken on a senior role. And in a sense, I think this maybe reflects a coming of age for the European Union. And, you know, it's probably, you know, sometimes the EU is described in terms of old and new member states, and it's probably time that the terminology of that terminology is dropped, and we simply have EU member states, or all of, you know, truly equal standing. So that may be, you know, symbolically important. The other leadership point I would make is it's correct, obviously, to think about the President of the Commission, the High Representative, and so on, but also to think about leadership from the member states. And what, you know, many observers are pointing out, and is very striking at the moment, if you look at Germany, Chancellor Scholz, you know, is domestically weak and is often criticised for lacking any real foreign policy vision, either for Germany or for Europe. In France, President Emmanuel Macron might be argued perhaps to suffer from too much vision. He's prone, arguably, to what could be called rhetorical grandstanding, but often perhaps that lacks substance. And again, now, of course, President Macron is also in a weak position. So if we look to the member states for leadership on EU foreign policy, that it's difficult to find there. And maybe one final comment, which I think relates to one of the broader themes which is emerging here, is EU leaders, whether of the EU institutions or at the national level, face the balancing act of, on the one hand, you know, standing up for liberal values of democracy, human rights, and so on, but also responding to the reality of the populist shift in public opinion and political parties in the member states, and how EU leaders do and should navigate that is a really challenging issue.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Just to kind of ask a follow-up question on this, if I may ask you to respond rather quickly, but how do you see it? Do you see, because we've we've discussed this, that there's been a change in the leadership positions. Do you see, can you predict, or do you see a fundamental change in European direction of European security policy if we go in the kind of reverse order again in the future?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is, again, the obvious point that Ursula von der Leyen has been reappointed, and you know that very strongly points towards more continuity than change. Kaja Kallas as the likely foreign policy high representative, you know, one would expect a continued strong position on Estonia, but I think my guess is that it would be more continuity rather than radical change in that context, I think.
Because I think the change happened already with Ukraine. Like now the election results and in some way, and also now definitely Kaja Kallas's kind of selection if the parliament so wishes in October to be the high representative is definitely a reaction to what's going on in Ukraine. So previously, of course, if we remember before Ukraine, it was the southern countries looking at the Mediterranean. It was about the migration. It was in that sense about Africa. It was about the south. And now, if you think about the common security and defense policy, for instance, the missions that EU is sending, EU has just opened new missions in Armenia, in Moldova. Ukraine already had one where I also have worked in the Balkans. There have been, but there were missions there are still, of course, missions in Africa, but the numbers, the presence is, there's a clear shift towards the east, and that's of course reactive and natural, of course, but it's not really the leadership has to follow in a sense. But then the question is, are they capable of having a vision where this really go, or just reacting to things that keep happening to us, and not that we are doing something to actually change something.
Yes, I would echo all that, absolutely. Then if we think of practical terms, the new triad, if we will have von der Leyen, if we will have Kallas, if we have Antonio Costa, I think they might be able to work quite effectively together. Who knows them, who knows their political priorities, but at least I see less clashes as we have at the moment. But then we come to the question of what is the vision of the foreign policy leadership vis-à-vis national politics. Of course, we have European Union has been branding in addition to peace, it has been branding itself through climate policies. And there is a big push against the Greens. So what will happen to European Union as a global actor in these terms? I don't know about the positions of the political leadership on climate policies, but yes, that would be quite interesting. You have...
If I may actually react to this, just the previous who was there to listen to the panel on enlargement, it also came up there because there is the discussion whether we have to rush and get Ukraine and Moldova in a fast track to the EU. This practically would mean that we have to do a trade-off of then having less kind of ambitious climate policy and green agenda and so on. So this foreign policy leadership is really in a position where they have to kind of choose between things that you shouldn't be choosing from, but having everything. But indeed, interesting years ahead.
Well, I think it's interesting because we are very much focusing in public discussions about this leadership in foreign security policy. It's very much about leadership in this Ukraine war. But as you said, that there is this enlargement question, there is Northern Africa, there is China, there is this global climate change and so on, also requiring, asking for leadership from the EU and from the Europeans. As a global actor, this is the question that is is the EU capable of being a global actor? So my question is, and we can start with Tanya, and then Andrew and Lena, that how you do actually, Andrew pointed that you put it very nicely, is limping towards a utopia, and somewhere between United Nations and federal state. So my question is, how do you see the current state of the EU as a global actor? And a follow-up question is, what do you consider as the most important, and now beyond the war in Ukraine, which is of course the first and foremost, but beyond that, the most important future challenges the EU is or might be facing?
Yeah, well, you gave it to me because I'm most interested in the near neighborhood. So sounded too Russian, that one. The neighborhood, because of course, I mean, how can EU be a global actor if it cannot have its act together when it comes to really close neighbors like the Western Balkans that are still in a limbo situation since 20 years, Albania, North Macedonia, Kosovo, who knows what, like Serbia. So we are with neighboring countries and we don't really have a vision for them. We don't, we have a technocratic negotiation process that doesn't have a political carrot anymore in a way. So how can we be how can European Union be a kind of a plausible a global actor if it's not trustworthy with its promises in its closest neighborhood? So that's kind of my question, and I think personally I think that EU should first really focus in the nearest regions, North Africa, Eastern neighborhood, rather than trying to because there are sometimes always these discussions. Let's send a CSDP mission to Latin America. That doesn't make any sense for a union that really still is a regional union. But that's because the problems are so close to my heart, that are close to the EU. That's my opinion. But others probably have other opinions.
If I understood correctly, before we can address to or global challenges, we need to clear up things in the neighborhood. Yes,
clear and be kind of how to say it. It's not really trustworthy, but kind of look like a actor that has a clear policy in the neighborhood, to have a clear policy with China or with Africa. Yeah.
Andrew, please.
Thanks. I mean, again, and I guess this goes back to some of my initial comments. I mean, I think often with the EU as a foreign policy actor, and specifically maybe in the global context, it's one of those glass half full, glass half empty questions, depending what you look at and so on. You could come to quite different conclusions. On the Ukraine war, you can make an argument that the EU has performed fairly well. I think if you looked at global climate negotiations over the last 20 plus years, which is something I've followed, there is a case that the EU has shown leadership, that Kyoto Agreement and then the Paris Agreement, the EU was a driver there. Now, of course, there's plenty of scope also to criticize EU policies as well. Maybe the one thing I would bring it to right at the moment over the last year is the Israel's war in Gaza, looked at from much of the rest of the world. Western, and I would include in this, EU policies are viewed as maintaining or containing a large double standard compared with the EU's policies towards the Ukraine war. That, in a political, diplomatic sense, has damaged Europe and the EU. Exactly how much we have to see, but I think that's a reality. And then in terms of your question about security policy priorities, I was struck that, in thinking about this, you could look at something like the EU's global strategy document of 2016. If you look at that document, essentially it says everything is a priority and we're going to do everything, and some rather vague ideas about how we're going to do everything. And if you read the literature on strategy, people always say one of the key things about good strategy is to actually identify a small number of things that you're really going to prioritize and to have a fairly clear idea about how you're going to address them. And I think the EU could certainly be criticized on those grounds.
Thank you. And Lena.
Thank you. I think Europe at the moment seems to be slightly lost. And here we come to the question of not prioritizing, doing everything but not doing anything as a consequence, as Andrew was saying. So of course, the thing is, if you don't know who you are and what you stand for and what are your priorities, then nobody else has no idea either. So, and then you need to clearly communicate that to outsiders as well. Which are most important issues for European insecurity sense? Well, I have to say, and here I probably speak a little bit against my own research, but if we really want to keep this planet livable, then of course the most important things should be climate, environment. We must remember that already it's so frightening that already 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been crossed. Who takes the leadership on that? So, yeah, that's a security issue that really is. Yeah, it has massive consequences if we don't do anything.
Yeah, thanks so much. Now I'm going to ask you a really difficult question and asking you to kind of speculate a bit about the future political developments. So how do you see the impact of political developments in the US and also in China for common European security policy? And here I would maybe ask this Andrew first, and then Lena and Tanya, you can comment if you wish. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Well, I think I can see from the monitor that the time is getting a bit short, so I'll just focus on China.
Yeah.
The way I think about China is that it's become more authoritarian domestically, more assertive internationally, and the EU is struggling to work out how to deal with this. On the one hand, the EU is pursuing some tougher policies towards China, and on the other hand, the EU sometimes focuses on the economic and trade benefits of China. And if anyone's familiar with the German debate on China policy, you can really see this kind of schizophrenia on how to approach China in Germany. That being said, I think the long-term direction is towards a tougher European policy or set of policies towards China, and that will be, I think, increasingly probably in coordination with the United States.
Thanks. With China, probably a reactionary role continues. I don't see in the foreseeable future Europe taking active leadership with China policies. But if we think of China as a global actor, very close ties to Russia, which has a real economic impact also to Europe, many countries, including Finland, trade is not going well with Russia for obvious reasons. So this means that new trade deals, new trade routes are probably being sought as we speak. If I then comment very quickly on US elections, they are highly important, of course. Nobody knows what will happen if Trump will be elected. At the same time, however, we might see less changes than many would hope for if Harris gets elected. Harris has announced, for instance, that she will continue Biden's policy towards Israel. So maybe there is not that much change after all.
And I get to comment only a little bit because I talk about the neighborhood mainly, but just a bit of a provocative thought about China is that indeed, because thinking about the European Union as a peace actor, China and many other third countries like India and so on are now taking interestingly the role of mediator and peace builder in a very different way than EU would, like not the value-based, what we were talking about, or what Lena was saying. So that's kind of something we need to keep an eye on and have a vision about, like how do we see China as a peacemaker? How do we see India as a peacemaker? Do we have an opinion as the European Union?
Okay, thank you very much. We are approaching the end of our panel, and my final question is actually coming back to Andrew's introductory note about this United Nations as a one end and the Federal Union on the other hand. A quick round, starting with Lena, then Tanya, and finally Andrew, that could a federal EU, as pointed out in different occasions, become a stronger political actor in Europe and world politics? What is your opinion?
Of course, it would be stronger, could be stronger, but I don't see such an option in the very foreseeable future.
Yeah, I don't see it either, but let's hope the utopia kind of word used here in a sense that we see it all the time in our daily work in Brussels, how difficult it is when it is unanimity decisions in the common security and defense policy, when it comes to the missions, when it comes to practical work on the ground, and there is someone. You couldn't even state anything jointly on Armenia-Azerbaijan situation on Nagorno-Karabakh because there was not unanimity. So EU is kind of kept silent sometimes. But just to say that sometimes we say that, okay, maybe in some cases there could be like alliances, like groups of people, like countries that accept something. Kosovo is a terribly good case of when it doesn't work. 5 countries don't recognize Kosovo. EU's policies on Kosovo are all the time kind of paralyzed because of this, and so it's definitely not an option in foreign policy to have a group of countries that agree something and others don't.
Thank you. I mean, just super briefly to mention qualified majority voting, I think that may be a sensible direction for the EU to go. It won't solve all of the EU's foreign policy problems, but it might be a step forward.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. I think we'll join with Kimmo and thanking our panelists, and I'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, we would like to thank you very much for the interesting discussion. Thank you for the public to come for this last panel today and in this European Forum, and hope to see you next year in the same occasion. Thank you very much.